In Chapter 21, Cain and Abel, René Guénon delves into the social and human consequences of the world's solidification, framing these changes through the ancient symbolism of Cain and Abel. This solidification manifests as a pervasive mechanization where everything is meticulously counted, recorded, and regulated. Modern administration, for instance, treats individuals as mere numerical units, aiming for complete uniformity and forcing people to conform to an average level. Guénon highlights a paradoxical outcome of this tendency. Despite advancements in modern industry leading to faster and easier communication between distant lands, the freedom of movement is simultaneously curtailed, making travel more difficult than in times devoid of mechanical transport. This signifies another facet of the world's solidification, where nomadic ways of life are increasingly suppressed in favor of sedentary existence. The core of the chapter's argument rests on the biblical symbolism of Cain, the farmer, and Abel, the stockmaster, representing the two primordial human types, sedentary and nomadic, respectively. Cain and the sedentary peoples are associated with the cultivation of the soil and, later, the building of towns. Towns, being artificial agglomerations of minerals, signify a more complete form of sedentarism than agricultural life, much as minerals are more fixed and solid than vegetables. The works of sedentary peoples are considered works of time, focused on developing activities within a strictly limited spatial domain and a continuous temporal framework. They tend to create visual symbols and plastic arts, architecture, sculpture, painting, that are developed in space. Abel and the nomadic peoples, conversely, are characterized by their mobility, raising flocks and herds. They do not build durable structures or plan for a distant future, but instead embrace the expansive possibilities of space. Nomads are associated with sonorous symbols and phonetic arts, music, poetry, which unfold in time, compatible with their continuous migration. Guénon explains that the slaying of Abel by Cain symbolizes the gradual absorption of nomadic peoples by sedentary ones throughout the ages. The modern world, with its overwhelming urbanization and efforts to enforce sedentary life, represents the ultimate triumph of Cain. These two human types also correspond to fundamental cosmic principles. Cain's sedentary nature aligns with the principle of compression, time, while Abel's nomadic existence aligns with the principle of expansion, space. Time, in its active opposition, consumes space by progressively reducing its expansion. The equilibrium between these two complementary principles is disrupted in the modern world. The traditional laws governing each type, including their sacrificial rites, reflected this balance. The rejection of Cain's vegetable offering and the acceptance, yet fatal consequence, of Abel's animal sacrifice highlight this broken equilibrium. Re-establishing balance would require exchanges where each type participates in the other's productions, a harmonization of inverse movements. This triple foundation of exchanges, spiritual, psychic, corporeal, underpins pacts, alliances, and benedictions in a normal, traditional state, which is now far removed from the modern world. Furthermore, Guénon notes the traditional prohibitions against census-taking in some traditions, linking it to the belief that counting animals too often can lead to their death. This illustrates a traditional understanding that the excessive quantification of existence, a hallmark of the reign of quantity, can have detrimental effects. The solidification of the world, therefore, leads to a society where everything is standardized and human differences are suppressed, driving humanity towards a state where the wheel will stop turning. In Chapter 22, titled The Significance of Metallurgy, René Guénon meticulously explores the profound implications of metallurgy within his overarching framework of the world's solidification and the reign of quantity. He posits that the arts and crafts involving the mineral kingdom, particularly metallurgy, are intrinsically linked to sedentary peoples, contrasting them with the nomadic way of life symbolized by Abel. Guénon highlights the traditional understanding of metals as possessing a twofold symbolism, both sacred and execrated, or benefic and malefic. This duality stems from their astral correspondences, wherein metals are perceived as planets of the lower world receiving and condensing planetary influences, thus embodying both positive and negative aspects. However, due to their subterranean origin, the malefic aspect tends to predominate. Historically, nomadic laws, such as the Hebrew law, often prohibited these activities, as seen in the requirement to prepare stones at the quarry for the temple in Jerusalem to avoid iron tools. This demonstrates an ancient awareness of the subtle influences associated with metals. The modern world, with its widespread and purely profane utilization of metals, represents a triumph of this malefic aspect. Guénon argues that profane use severs metals from their superior principles, allowing only their detrimental influences to proliferate unchecked. This unbridled development of metallurgy, including its role in construction, replacing wood and stone, and industry, signifies an advanced phase in the cyclical descent towards solidification. Towns, as artificial agglomerations of minerals, are presented as the ultimate expression of sedentarism, further solidifying the world. Beyond solidification, metals are also implicated in the world's eventual dissolution. Guénon suggests that the subtle influences attached to metals, though latent during periods of pronounced materialism, remain active in a hidden manner, contributing to the satanic dimension of mechanistic theory and its destructive applications. As the world passes the peak of solidification and moves towards increasing instability, these malefic influences find more opportunity to assert themselves openly, pushing the world closer to its end. The chapter also delves into the symbolism of the guardians of the hidden treasure, often depicted as giants or dwarves who are connected to metals and the subterranean fire. These figures represent psychic entities whose access is dangerous for the unqualified, and they are understood as active threats to the world's solidity, embodying the infernal aspects of cosmic psychism. Crucially, Guénon emphasizes the significance of traditional ritual prohibitions against carrying metallic objects during certain rites. These practices, found in traditions like Islamic pilgrimage and Western initiations, stripping of metals, are not merely symbolic, but have real, effective consequences. Metals are seen as capable of affecting adversely the transmission of spiritual influences, and are metaphorically linked to the rinds or shells, klipoth, of Kabbalah, representing the infracorporeal pit of our world. Modern man, with his limited faculties and materialistic perspective, dismisses these effects as mere auto-suggestion, failing to grasp the deeper realities and dangers involved. In conclusion, the significance of metallurgy illustrates how the development and profane application of metalwork reflect and actively contribute to the progressive spiritual decline and materialization of the world, ultimately pointing towards its eventual dissolution and the triumph of base, malefic influences. Through this, Guénon demonstrates how a seemingly mundane human activity serves as a potent indicator and accelerant of the cosmic cycle's downward trajectory. In Chapter 23, Time Changed into Space, René Guénon elaborates on the dynamic interplay between time and space within the framework of cyclical manifestation, ultimately describing how time, in the final phases of a cosmic cycle, undergoes a transformative dissolution into space. This transformation is a pivotal aspect of the world's solidification and subsequent dissolution. Guénon begins by reiterating that time is not homogeneous but is qualified differently at every moment by the cyclical conditions of manifestation. This leads to a progressive contraction of time, evident in the ever-increasing speed with which events unfold, especially towards the end of a cycle. He points to the decreasing lengths of the 4 Hindu yugas and the shortening of human life as examples of this phenomenon. In this process, time, acting actively and in opposition to spatial expansion, consumes space. Carried to its extreme limit, this contraction would reduce time to a single instant, effectively ending duration and succession, thus manifesting as time the devourer ends by devouring itself. And ultimately, there will be no more time at the end of the world. In such a state, death, which is tied to succession, becomes impossible. This cessation of succession and the attainment of perfect simultaneity is precisely what Guénon means by time has been changed into space. Cosmologically, he interprets this as the final revenge of Abel on Cain, linking it back to the symbolism of nomadic expansion, Abel times space, overcoming sedentary compression, Cain/time. He notes that modern mathematicians' attempts to incorporate time as a fourth coordinate in space, often as imaginal time, implicitly acknowledge that time must cease to exist as such to become a spatial dimension, an event only truly realizable at the end of the world. When time's compressive tendency no longer opposes space, space undergoes a dilatation, a higher power of indefinity that cannot be represented by corporeal images. The end of the cycle, characterized by this transformation, is deemed intemporal and signifies a restoration of the primordial state. This restored state is equivalent to a return to the center of the world, which is manifested externally at the cycle's beginning as the terrestrial paradise and at its end as the heavenly Jerusalem. Throughout the cycle, the center remains hidden as humanity drifts away from it, a movement from essence to substance, center to circumference, and unity to multiplicity, which Guénon calls the fall. The Pardes, supreme region, though seemingly distant, is eternally at the center, and its true proximity is only realized when the temporal condition is suppressed. At this center, where time is changed into space, all succession is excluded, and everything appears in perfect simultaneity, constituting the seat of immortality accessed through man's recovery of the sense of eternity via the third eye. In essence, Chapter 23 describes a profound reordering of cosmic conditions, where the qualitative aspects of time lead to its accelerated contraction and eventual collapse into a state of pure spatial simultaneity. This metaphysical event marks both the completion of a cyclical descent and the beginning of a new one, signifying a return to an essential, a temporal unity. In Chapter 24, Toward Dissolution, René Guénon outlines the transition from the world's solidification to its ultimate dissolution, a process that marks a new and more advanced stage in the cyclical descent of manifestation. He explains that while the previous phase was characterized by an extreme solidification or materialization, epitomized by explicit materialism and mechanism, this dominance is now waning, at least in theoretical, scientific and philosophical thought. Guénon notes that the acceleration of time itself contributes to this dissolution, with events unfolding ever more rapidly, a natural consequence of the cycle's final periods. Modern physical theories, in their pursuit of an exclusively quantitative character, are becoming increasingly abstract and mathematical, thus detaching further from sensible reality and approaching the domain of pure quantity. However, Guénon clarifies that the solid state, even at its densest, is not equivalent to pure quantity, as it still possesses qualitative elements and corporeal characteristics, including continuous space. Pure quantity, being discontinuous, like number, cannot encompass corporeal existence. The process of dissolution manifests in two primary ways. Pulverization. This describes the reduction of corporeal bodies into atomic dust, lacking cohesion, a consequence of the drive to assimilate continuous quantity to discontinuous quantity. Volatilization. More comprehensively, this signifies the complete disappearance of corporeal manifestation. Positive results of the cycle are crystallized and transmuted into germs for the future cycle, marking the benefic aspect of solidification. Conversely, negative and unusable elements are precipitated into the infracorporeal regions of the subtle domain, representing the malefic aspect. Both processes involve a passage into extracorporeal modalities, effectively signaling the end of corporeal manifestation for the current cycle. Crucially, this dissolution is not merely a passive outcome but requires the active intervention of something more directly effective than the inherent tendencies of the reign of quantity. This involves the unleashing of inferior subtle influences from the lower subtle domain, often referred to as inferior cosmic psychism, which penetrate the sensible world through fissures in the Great Wall that traditionally protects it. These forces are inherently destructive and disorganizing, specifically suited for achieving dissolution. Guénon is critical of traditionalists, who may misinterpret the decline of materialism as a positive sign. He argues that they are often unwitting tools of a diabolical plan, failing to discern the quality of these emerging subtle influences. Materialism, in a paradoxical sense, offered a shell or a limited immunity against subtle influences due to its thickness of conventionally recognized scientific conceptions. However, the opening of these fissures from below allows destructive influences to enter with reduced resistance, as the superior, benefic influences are simultaneously blocked by the modern, profane attitude. This new phase, characterized by the intervention of inferior psychism, represents a dangerous pseudo-realization leading to an inverted spirituality. Guénon warns that this is a delusion, worse and more dangerous than materialism, because its consequences are far more extensive and profound, marking a fresh stage in the development of the counter-initiation's subversive plan. In Chapter 25, The Fissures in the Great Wall, René Guénon describes the perilous state of the modern world as it transitions from extreme solidification towards its ultimate dissolution. He introduces the symbolism of the Great Wall as a protective barrier that normally shields the corporeal world from destructive subtle influences originating from the inferior subtle domain. However, due to the prolonged deviation of the modern era, this wall is now developing fissures, allowing these malefic forces to penetrate and accelerate the world's disintegration. Guénon explains that the concept of a closed system promoted by materialists is an illusion. The world's solidification, while giving the impression of material stability, has reached and passed its peak, leading to an increasing state of instability. The protective Great Wall acts as both a defense and a limitation, traditionally preventing attacks from below while allowing communication with superior spiritual domains from above. However, the shell of materialism, which characterizes modern thought, has paradoxically blocked off superior influences, leaving only the fissures at the base of the wall open for inferior forces to enter with reduced resistance. This leaves the world defenseless against dangers that the modern mentality, blinded by its own limitations, cannot even perceive. The penetrating malefic influences are identified with powerful, destructive entities in various traditions. In Islamic tradition, these are the devastating hordes of Gog and Magog, while in Hindu tradition, they are the demons Koka and Vikoka. Guénon links these to the guardians of the hidden treasure and the smiths of the subterranean fire, themes from Chapter 22. Entities with a decidedly malefic aspect that maintain an underground existence and are sometimes depicted as giants or dwarfs. These attempts to infiltrate the corporeal world are not new, dating back to the beginning of the Kali Yuga, a period far more ancient than profane historians acknowledge, as evidenced by traditions like the Chinese account of Nukua repairing a tear in the sky early in this cycle. Historically, spiritual centers once maintained vigilance and could repair such fissures. However, the modern period, especially its second phase, the present, presents a different scenario. The solidification of the first modern phase created a false sense of security, an immunity from subtle influences due to its thickness of conventionally recognized scientific conceptions. Now, with that thickness waning and the fissures widening due to the further progression of the descending cycle, the world is increasingly vulnerable. The spiritual center's capacity to transmit superior influences is hampered by this materialistic shell, leaving no effective defense against the hordes of Gog and Magog. Guénon highlights the role of widespread ignorance and even well-intentioned traditionalists and spiritualists in exacerbating this vulnerability. Many, still influenced by materialistic habits, are unaware of these dangers and lack the necessary effective knowledge to combat them. Their sincere but blind efforts, often channeled through neo-spiritualist organizations, intuitionist philosophies, or metaphysical sciences, become unwitting tools for the diabolical plan of the counter-initiation. These unconscious auxiliaries actively contribute to the opening of the fissures and the propagation of destructive subtle forces by mistaking them for genuine spiritual phenomena. In summary, Chapter 25 reveals that the fissures in the Great Wall are not merely symbolic, but represent actual breaches in the world's metaphysical defenses, orchestrated by an anti-traditional force. Modernity, through its materialistic outlook and subsequent pseudo-realizations, has paradoxically created the very conditions for these destructive, inferior, subtle influences to emerge more openly, pushing the world ever closer to its ultimate dissolution. In Chapter 26, Shamanism and Sorcery, René Guénon delves into phenomena that, while seemingly outside the direct purview of the modern world, possess the capacity to exert a disorganizing influence within it. This chapter serves to clarify misunderstandings about purely material things and to illustrate how distorted traditional practices can be manipulated within the broader context of the world's dissolution and the anti-traditional agenda. Guénon begins by challenging the modern conception of purely material or inanimate objects, arguing that this idea is an exclusive product of the modern mentality. He asserts that the corporeal world is not self-sufficient but proceeds entirely from the subtle order, which in turn is connected to spiritual principles. Consequently, every corporeal existence inherently contains subtle elements, which he terms psychic or animic. This traditional understanding, which he refers to as a true animism, contrasts sharply with the mechanistic view, suggesting that life is a fundamental condition of all corporeal existence, making the distinction between living and non-living ultimately superficial. He criticizes modern ethnologists for labeling this inherent understanding as primitive religion or superstition, when in reality it represents a more accurate cosmological perspective. A key point of the chapter is the critique of how traditional forms are often perceived by modern scholarship. Guénon explains that when a tradition degenerates, its superior, metaphysical or spiritual aspects tend to disappear, leaving the secondary cosmological and psychic elements to assume disproportionate importance. This leads to misinterpretations, such as reducing profound rites and symbols to mere magic or sorcery. He then specifically examines shamanism as an example of a degenerate traditional form, while acknowledging its roots in a regular and normal traditional form with a developed cosmology, e.g., the separation of three worlds, and rites comparable to those of the highest orders, like Vedic rites. Guénon points out its degeneration. The shaman's focus on magic and divination, inferior traditional sciences, and the disquieting individual connection to an animal, potentially leading to practices like lycanthropy, are cited as signs of this deviation. Guénon distinguishes genuine shamanism from conscious Satanism, noting that shamans primarily aim to prevent or neutralize malefic psychic influences rather than worship them. However, he warns that handling such forces without recourse to superior, truly spiritual influences inevitably leads to real sorcery. Unlike the last scraps of Western rustic magic, shamanic magic retains a dangerous vitality due to its constant contact with inferior psychic forces. This makes it a potential instrument for more conscious and extensive anti-traditional plans by accumulating these forces at predetermined points to serve the powers responsible for the whole modern deviation. In essence, Chapter 26 reveals how the breakdown of the Great Wall, the protective barrier safeguarding the corporeal world from inferior subtle influences, is not just a passive event, but is actively facilitated by the misuse and degeneration of traditional knowledge. The psychic residues left by decaying traditions can be captured and subverted, transforming them into instruments for a deliberate, anti-traditional action that aims to further the world's dissolution. This is particularly dangerous because modern man, steeped in a materialistic outlook, is largely unaware of these subtle dangers, and even when well-intentioned, often becomes an unwitting auxiliary in the diabolical plan of the counter-initiation. In Chapter 27, Psychic Residues, René Guénon explores how the remnants of decayed spiritual and traditional practices as well as the subtle traces left by past beings and civilizations, contribute to the accelerating dissolution of the modern world. He introduces the concept of psychic residues as potent, disorganizing influences that, having been abandoned by their original spiritual direction, can be exploited for malefic ends. Guénon draws a significant analogy, stating that the vestiges of a degenerate tradition are fully comparable to the case of the psychic remains left behind by a human being in passing to another state. These are described as wandering influences that at most retain an illusory likeness to their original form. The origin of these residues lies in places or objects that were once charged with spiritual influences, which necessarily take appropriate supports in the psychic and corporeal orders to manifest. When these spiritual influences withdraw, the corporeal supports will nonetheless remain charged with psychic elements that will be all the stronger and more active by reason of their concentration. These psychic residues are inherently dangerous. Guénon warns that important traditional and initiatic centers, more or less long since extinct, must in general be the most important potential sources of danger. This danger stems either from violent reactions provoked in the psychic conglomerates persisting in such places by sheer imprudence, as with modern archaeologists who disturb them unknowingly, or from their seizure by black magicians. He notes that some ancient civilizations, like ancient Egypt, degenerated through excessive development of magic in its final phases, leaving behind psychic influences of a very inferior order embedded in their remains. These influences, now deprived of the spirit that formerly directed them, are reduced to a larval state and can react in a more or less disordered manner when provoked, irrespective of the provocateur's intentions. Modern antiquarian researches, by exhuming these vestiges, unknowingly contribute to opening up some of the fissures in the world's protective barriers. Crucially, these subtle influences are at the mercy of anyone who knows how to capture them, and can be directed toward the most diverse and even the most contradictory ends. If a black magician gains control, these forces are employed for purposes quite contrary to that for which they might have been used in earlier times by the qualified representatives of a regular tradition. Guénon further explains that even living but degenerated traditions, such as shamanism, can become instruments for anti-traditional forces. In such cases, certain forms of knowledge, having lost their spiritual grounding, can still be transmitted but are prone to every kind of deviation. The psychic influences operating within these traditions can be captured even without the knowledge of their nominal guardians, utilizing living men who serve no less well as supports to the influences. The adversary, or satanic forces, actively seek to possess places that were once significant spiritual centers, not only for their accumulated psychic influences, but also because of their inherent privileged nature, their sacred geography. This knowledge, once used for legitimate purposes, can be diverted from its legitimate purpose and applied inversely for malefic ends. Guénon points out that the danger of misdirecting such knowledge is why secrecy was historically essential in traditional civilizations, a concept entirely lost to modern comprehension. Invoking the adage corruptio optimi pessima, the corruption of the best is the worst, Guénon asserts that the perversion of what was once spiritually potent leads to the most formidable forms of harm. These residues are likened to the products of the decomposition of a once living being, and, being contagious, they exert a particularly dissolving and disaggregating action. This phenomenon is described as a form of necromancy operating on non-human psychic remains with a scope far more extensive than that of common witchcraft. Modern man's incurable blindness, due to his profane and materialistic attitude, makes him wholly susceptible to these dangers, unwittingly aiding the anti-traditional action that drives the world toward its final dissolution. In Chapter 28, The Successive Stages in Anti-Traditional Action, René Guénon meticulously outlines the deliberate and methodical process by which the modern world has been shaped, culminating in an accelerating state of dissolution. He posits that this anti-traditional action is not a spontaneous or fortuitous development, but rather a consciously guided operation involving human agents, which conforms to the specific characteristics of the cyclical period. The human agents responsible for this process belong to what Guénon terms the counter-initiation. Guénon observes that modern civilization appears increasingly artificial, denatured, and falsified, a condition that necessitates a correspondingly manufactured mentality. This anti-traditional action, he explains, aimed first at a fundamental change in the general mentality and the destruction of traditional institutions in the West, as it was the initial and most direct theatre of operation. The first major phase of this anti-traditional action focused on confining individuals within the limits of their own individuality and, subsequently, within the narrower confines of the corporeal world. This was achieved through several key developments: rationalism. This movement denied humanity the use of transcendent faculties, thereby limiting the being to its individual capabilities. Guénon traces its precursors back to Renaissance humanism and its early forms within Protestantism, even before it fully materialized as a philosophical doctrine. Focus on external and sensible objects. This led to the emergence of modern science, which, by directing human attention exclusively to sensible objects, effectively enclosed the individual within the corporeal domain, making this limitation progressively more effective. Mechanism and materialism. Cartesian mechanism paved the way for materialism, which then solidified the mental horizon to the corporeal domain, stripping it of anything not considered material. This marked the true entry into the reign of quantity. Profane science, becoming increasingly quantitative, and materialism, evolving into a widespread practical materialism, or instinct, reinforced this. Man became mechanized, reducing himself to numerical units lost in the uniformity and indistinction of the masses, signifying the most complete triumph of quantity over quality imaginable. Guénon notes that while this work of materialization and quantification is ongoing, it can never be fully completed within manifestation, as a complete reduction to pure quantity is unrealizable. However, as the world reached its maximum possible solidification, a second, seemingly opposed but ultimately complementary, phase of anti-traditional action began to emerge concurrently with materialism itself. This new phase leads not to further solidification, but to dissolution, reinforcing the reduction to quantity by attempting to assimilate continuous to discontinuous quantity. In this stage, quantitative science becomes less strictly materialistic, and the very notion of matter begins to fade and dissolve. While practical materialism persists, it ceases to be the principal force in the anti-traditional agenda. The objective of this second phase is to open the corporeal world up again from below, so as to allow the dissolving and destructive forces of the inferior subtle domain to penetrate into it. This unleashing of inferior forces is intended to complete the world's deviation and bring it toward final dissolution. At this point, the counter-initiation takes center stage in the designs of what was at first comprehensively described as the adversary. Guénon clarifies that these two phases, though partly simultaneous, follow a logical progression, with the first phase laying the groundwork for the second to fully manifest its destructive potential. In Chapter 29, Deviation and Subversion, René Guénon refines his analysis of the anti-traditional forces at play in the modern world, distinguishing between deviation as a gradual departure from the normal state and subversion as its ultimate, contradictory culmination. This distinction is crucial for understanding the methodical decline of modern civilization. Guénon explains that deviation represents an indefinite series of gradual, imperceptible changes that steadily lead toward the establishment of the reign of quantity. Examples he provides include the progression of the modern mentality from humanism and rationalism to mechanism and subsequently to materialism. Similarly, profane science, through its successive theories, has become increasingly quantitative. These developments progressively narrow human perspectives, confining individuals first within their individuality, then within the corporeal world, and ultimately reducing everything to quantitative terms. However, when deviation reaches its extreme limit, it transforms into subversion, becoming a state diametrically opposed to the normal order. Guénon explicitly states that subversion should not be confused with the reversal at the end of the cycle, which is a rectification, but rather it is the goal of deviation, manifested by counterfeit or parody. He attributes this subversive character to a satanic nature, equating it with the spirit of negation and lying. The adage, "Satan is the ape of God," is invoked, signifying that anti-traditional forces imitate and falsify the very things they oppose, presenting disorder as a false order or hiding the denial of principles under the affirmation of false ones. This involves an element of the grotesque which, though often apparent, escapes detection by those unconsciously subjected to the pervasive suggestions of the modern world. Guénon offers numerous examples of this parody in modern life. Civic or lay pseudo-rites replacing religious ones, self-styled naturism being no less artificial than the complications it pretends to react against, and the contradictory idea of an organization of leisure. He suggests that much of the modern world could accurately be prefaced with pseudo-religion, pseudo-nature, pseudo-comfort, and even pseudo-science, because they are falsifications aiming to obscure the truth. The possibility and increasing perfection of such counterfeits are rooted in the inverse analogy between the highest and lowest points of existence. As the cycle descends towards the domain of pure quantity, imitations of principial unity appear as uniformity and simplicity. This shows that deviation, when fully developed, inevitably leads to subversion, particularly when what is most inferior attempts to imitate superior and transcendent principles. Finally, Guénon clarifies that this first phase of anti-traditional action, culminating in crude materialism, was a preparation. The second phase, a work of subversion, is destined to establish an inverted spirituality by unleashing inferior subtle forces. A particularly clear example of this subversion, and the topic for the subsequent chapter, is the intentional inversion of traditional symbols. In Chapter 30, The Inversion of Symbols, René Guénon delves into the complex nature of symbolism, specifically focusing on how traditional symbols can possess dual meanings, often appearing to be contrary, and how these can be deliberately subverted for anti-traditional ends. This discussion builds upon the concept of subversion introduced in Chapter 29, presenting the intentional inversion of traditional symbols as a key aspect of anti-traditional action. Guénon explains that the appearance of two seemingly contrary senses in a single symbol stems from a fundamental duality inherent in all manifestation. This duality, he clarifies, is ultimately a complementarism rather than an irreducible opposition. Opposing terms are reconciled at higher levels, returning to the unity of their common principle. He outlines how a duality can be arranged vertically, e.g., the two triangles of Solomon's seal representing opposing directions along an axis, or horizontally, for example, the two serpents of the caduceus, symmetrical yet contrary in significance. The qualitative value of the directions of space is essential to understanding these distinctions. The concept of benefic and malefic aspects, though not moral, are used in a purely technical sense in relation to specific applications of symbols. Guénon stresses that the distinction between these aspects is contingent and vanishes when viewed from a higher complementary perspective. However, it is precisely from the misuses of this perspective that the subversion of symbolic interpretation and use arises. Subversion can manifest in two ways, either by giving supremacy to the malefic aspect while still recognizing it as such, or by attributing a meaning opposite to the legitimate one, treating a malefic aspect as benefic, or vice versa. Guénon notes that this inversion may not always be outwardly apparent, especially in symbols where the two contrary aspects are not visually distinct, such as the serpent, which can symbolize either the beneficent agathodaimon or the malefic kakodaimon. For symbols with distinct positions, like geometrical forms, true subversion involves a real intention to invert in such a way as formally to contradict the normal and legitimate value. Examples include the inverted triangle in black magic or the use of reversed mantras in sorcery. The most dangerous form of subversion, according to Guénon, is that which deforms the meaning of symbols or reverses their import while making no change in their outward appearance. The counter-initiation particularly employs a diabolical trick by attributing its own inverted interpretations to orthodox symbolism within traditional organizations, thereby promoting confusions and uncertainties. This subtle method allows anti-traditional forces to manipulate even those who believe they are fighting against them, turning them unwittingly into best servants of the adversary. This deliberate falsification and inversion of symbols serve as a powerful tool in the satanic agenda of the anti-traditional action, leading the world further into disorder and confusion.